Hey everyone, so let's now talk about shading particles because that is a bit challenging and a bit annoying. So what I have here is based on a geometry that comes in, I scatter a couple of points or emit a couple of points that then move on the surface. This is a bit like our root example. And then I render the whole thing. And currently we render them on top of the base sculpture. So if I render this, it looks like this, and you can see the points are massive, which is kind of funny. It's kind of cool. He is now built from spheres, but let's say we don't want them so big. And we saw that in the last video. The problem here is that by default, our PopNet doesn't give us a p-scale. So what I've prepared here is a randomizer that just gives us a random p-scale with a maximum size of 0.02. Of course, you could have done that with an attribute randomize as well. So the p-scale will now be between 0.02 and 0. And what we then get is this. Cool. So this is what we saw in the last video. Nice. And it looks a bit weird. And all I wanted actually is to render the points alone without our sculpture. But we want to give it the same shading. So first of all, I turn off my geometry here, my sculpture, so that we now render only the points, and let's shade the points. And that shouldn't be too hard because, we already know we can use the material node. There you go. So they're now gray, and we just want to turn them into a red sphere person. So all we need, of course, is a material node. Should be straightforward. And I already have my material prepared. It's called PSGeo. And if I render this now, I should see my spheres turn red, but they're not. So what's going on here? Let me middle click. What I'm usually looking for is a shop material path. And interesting enough, we have one primitive attribute, even though we have no primitives. And this is where the problem lies actually. The shop material path is set correctly, but if you have no primitives to save them on, how should it work? So cool, that's fine. I guess all we have to do then is we switch it to point attributes, right? Because then we have our shop material path, here it is, on the points. And as you can see, it re-rendered. Let's double check that this is not some kind of hiccup. And it still doesn't work. So we assigned now the shop material path to the points, and it is there and everything seems to work, but it still doesn't do anything. And this is really annoying. You can't assign a material assignment to particles directly. And the primitive part makes sense because we have no primitives, but the point part, why that doesn't work, is not actually that obvious. And I had a couple of discussions with colleagues about this. Our theory is that it has to do with the fact that the spheres will be assigned to the points later at the rendering stage. So whatever is assigned material-wise on the points will be ignored once the spheres are copied to them. So how do we solve this? The easiest way of solving this is to just ignore the material node and use what I usually would not recommend to do, and that is assign the material on the whole geometry. And you can do this here under render material, and then we look for our PSGeo. And if we render this now, that actually works. There you go. Finally, we have red spheres with specularity on it. Great. This works and this is fine. This is a technique you can do. I personally still don't like it because I find this not very elegant and hard to read, because I like to read everything that happens on the sub level. So I want this to work with a material node. And the way you make this work is actually in the end the same, because the third option we have is setting it to detail. And that just means, as you know, we set the shop material path on basically everything in this stream, and not just particular points or primitives, but everything in the stream. And this actually works as well. So I turned off the material outside, and by switching this to now detail attribute and I render again, we will see the red spheres again. So this is how I would do it, because it's still easier to read that, okay, someone assigned a material here in this process and I find what it is. I don't have to go outside on the geometry level again. So this is why I prefer that. Just keep it in mind. Because of that, I usually tend to render particles in the separate geometry besides not mixing different geometry types. So I usually try to keep particles and normal geometry separated in different geometry nodes, because this way the materials will not fight each other. Because the problem with this approach here, or the same with a material on the geometry node, is that it will override any other material that is assigned to primitives or points, because even here it's assigned to detail, and detail always has priority over points and primitive attributes. So this makes working or shading with particles pretty annoying, and this is why this video exists. So keep that in mind. It's a bit annoying, but once you know that, there are always ways to make it work. For example, by splitting up your geometries like here into separate geometry nodes, and then it's much easier to make this work. Now, a small note on this: when you work with Solaris, you don't have that problem. You can bring in your points however you want. I do it with a scene import, and as you can see, as soon as I bring in points, they of course will be rendered as spheres based on the P scale attribute. And then you can assign materials like you usually would directly onto the points. And that's because in Solaris, everything is called a primitive. Don't get confused. A primitive in Solaris doesn't mean a face. In Solaris, basically every object is called a primitive. And since points are a primitive like everything else, you can assign materials exactly like you assign them to anything else. So the problem with assigning materials to points doesn't exist in Solaris. There it is straightforward. If you know how to assign materials in Solaris, you can do this with points as well. All right, so I hope this was helpful. Thanks very much and see you later. Cheers.